This is breaking news, and it is the kind of moment that changes the trajectory of an entire region overnight. A ceasefire shattered, a fragile pause in one of the most dangerous geopolitical standoffs in the world, completely broken. And now, what we are witnessing is not just another exchange of fire, but the early signals of something far bigger, far more dangerous, and potentially far more global. Israel has moved, decisively, aggressively, and according to multiple emerging reports, it has carried out a sudden escalation that effectively ends the ceasefire that many believed, perhaps naively, would hold. But here is where it gets serious. Iran has not stayed silent. In fact, Iran's response has been swift, coordinated, and by all indications, large-scale. We are not talking about symbolic retaliation. We are talking about a response designed to send a message, not just to Israel, but to the entire world. Let that sink in. Because what just happened is not an isolated incident. This is not a border skirmish. This is not a miscalculation. This is the kind of escalation that military analysts fear, the kind that has been quietly building behind the scenes for months, if not years. And now, it is unfolding in real time. Think about that for a second. A ceasefire exists for one reason: to prevent exactly this kind of chain reaction, to create space, to buy time, to stop escalation before it spirals out of control. But when a ceasefire breaks like this, suddenly, violently, and with immediate retaliation, it tells you something very important. It tells you that the underlying tensions were never resolved. It tells you that both sides were preparing, waiting, calculating, and now the calculations are over. Now the moves are being made in the open. But here's the part nobody is talking about. This isn't just about Israel and Iran. No, this is about alliances. This is about power projection. This is about deterrence, and whether it has just failed. Because when one side breaks a ceasefire and the other responds with force at scale, what you are witnessing is not just conflict. You are witnessing a test of red lines, a test of military readiness, a test of how far each side is willing to go, and how far the world will let them go. And let me tell you something, these tests rarely stay contained. They spread. They pull in other players. They trigger reactions from governments, from markets, from militaries across the globe. And that is exactly why this moment matters. Because what we are seeing right now could either remain a regional escalation, or it could become the opening chapter of something much larger, something far more unpredictable, something far more dangerous. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because to truly understand what just happened tonight, you have to look beyond the headlines. You have to understand the sequence, the decisions, the timing, and the signals that were ignored or perhaps deliberately dismissed. Because nothing about this feels accidental. Nothing about this feels spontaneous. This feels calculated. It feels intentional. And most importantly, it feels like the beginning of a new phase. So the question you have to ask yourself right now is simple, but deeply unsettling. Was this inevitable, or was this a choice? And if it was a choice, then what comes next may already be in motion. Stay with me. In the early hours, under conditions that many analysts are now describing as highly coordinated and pre-planned, Israeli forces initiated a series of targeted operations. These were not random strikes. These were precision actions, focused, deliberate, and aimed at specific locations believed to be tied to Iranian-linked infrastructure and strategic assets. And here is where things get critical. These strikes reportedly went beyond the usual patterns we have seen in previous flare-ups. We are not talking about limited deterrence or symbolic messaging. We are talking about operations that cross a threshold that, until now, both sides had been careful not to breach during the ceasefire period. Think about that. A ceasefire is not just a pause in fighting, it is an understanding, an unspoken agreement that both sides will hold back, even if tensions remain high. But this time, that understanding was broken, and it was broken in a way that immediately forced a response. Because within hours, not days, Iran began to move. Missile systems were reportedly activated. Air defense networks went on high alert, and multiple sources are indicating that a coordinated wave of retaliation was launched, targeting positions linked to Israeli military interests and allied infrastructure across multiple zones. Let that sink in. This was not hesitation. This was not diplomacy. This was immediate escalation. Now ask yourself, why so fast? Why was the response so rapid, so organized, so large in scale? Because this wasn't improvised. This wasn't a reaction built in the moment. This was prepared. This was something that had already been planned, mapped out, and ready to execute the moment the red line was crossed. And that tells you something extremely important. Both sides were expecting this. Both sides were ready for this exact scenario. And that changes everything. Because when two adversaries are not only willing but prepared to escalate instantly, it means the situation was already sitting on the edge. It means the ceasefire wasn't holding things together. It was barely containing something much bigger underneath. But here is where the story takes another turn. Reports are also emerging that this escalation may have been triggered by more than just immediate military concerns. There are indications, still developing but impossible to ignore, that intelligence movements, covert operations, and shifting regional alliances played a role in pushing this situation to the breaking point. Think about that for a second. This may not just be about what happened today. This may be about what has been happening quietly for weeks, for months, behind closed doors, movements that didn't make headlines, signals that weren't fully understood, or perhaps were ignored. Because in geopolitics, escalation rarely comes out of nowhere. It builds, layer by layer, decision by decision, until one move, just one, tips the balance. And that is exactly what this feels like, a tipping point. Now here is the part nobody is talking about. The locations targeted, on both sides, suggest something far more strategic than a simple exchange of fire. These are not random choices. These are calculated targets designed to send very specific messages. Messages about capability, messages about reach, messages about what each side is willing and able to do next. Because when you choose a target in a moment like this, you are not just hitting a location. You are communicating intent. You are signaling escalation or restraint. And in this case, the signals coming from both sides are not signals of restraint. They are signals of readiness. Readiness for a prolonged confrontation. Readiness for a broader conflict if necessary. And this is where things become deeply concerning. Because once both sides move into that mindset, de-escalation becomes much harder. Every move becomes a response. Every response becomes a justification for the next move. And before you know it, the situation is no longer under control. It is simply unfolding. So now we are left with a reality that is as dangerous as it is clear. The ceasefire is effectively over. The lines have been crossed. And both Israel and Iran are now actively engaged in a cycle of action and reaction that is accelerating by the hour. Think about what that means, not just for the region, but for the world. Because conflicts like this, when they reach this stage, do not stay isolated for long. They expand, they draw in allies, they shift global attention, they disrupt economies, and sometimes they trigger something far bigger than anyone initially expected. And that brings us to the next critical question. Why does this matter so much? Why is this not just another headline, but a moment that could reshape the geopolitical landscape? Because what comes next is not just about military strikes. It is about consequences, massive, far-reaching consequences. But this time, it's different, and you need to understand why. First, this escalation is happening in a global environment that is already under extreme pressure. We are not in a stable world right now. We are in a world where conflicts are overlapping, alliances are shifting, and trust between major powers is already at a breaking point. So when something like this happens between Israel and Iran, it doesn't stay contained. It connects, it amplifies, it triggers ripple effects that move far beyond the immediate battlefield. Let me explain what that means. Start with energy. The Middle East is not just a region. It is the center of global energy flow. A significant percentage of the world's oil supply moves through this region. And any instability here immediately sends shockwaves through global markets. Think about that. If this escalation threatens key shipping routes, even indirectly, oil prices don't just rise, they spike. And when oil prices spike, everything else follows. Transportation costs go up, food prices go up, inflation increases, economies that are already struggling get pushed even further to the edge. Let that sink in. This isn't just about missiles and military strikes. This is about the price of fuel in your country. This is about the cost of living. This is about economic stability on a global scale. But here's where things get even more serious. This conflict has the potential to pull in other players, and that is the part that should concern everyone, because Israel does not operate in isolation, and neither does Iran. Both are deeply connected to networks of alliances, partnerships, and regional actors who have their own interests, their own agendas, and their own red lines. So when tensions escalate at this level, those networks start to activate. You begin to see indirect involvement, support operations, strategic positioning, and sometimes direct engagement. Think about that for a second. What starts as a bilateral conflict can quickly become something much larger, a multi-front confrontation that stretches across borders and involves multiple actors. And once that happens, controlling the situation becomes exponentially more difficult. But here is the part nobody is talking about. This escalation is also a test of global leadership, a test of how major powers respond when a critical region moves toward instability. Will they step in diplomatically? Will they apply pressure? Or will they take sides, openly or quietly, and allow the situation to evolve into something more dangerous? Because make no mistake, every major capital in the world is watching this right now. Every intelligence agency, every military command, every economic strategist. They are all asking the same question: how far will this go? And more importantly, who will get involved? Now let's talk about deterrence. Because deterrence is supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. It is supposed to create a balance where both sides understand the cost of escalation and choose to hold back. But what we are seeing right now raises a very uncomfortable possibility. What if deterrence is no longer working? Think about that. If one side is willing to break a ceasefire and the other is willing to respond immediately at scale, then the fear of escalation is no longer enough to stop action. And that is when conflicts become unpredictable. That is when miscalculations happen. That is when things spiral. Because once deterrence weakens, the guardrails disappear. And without those guardrails, even a small incident can trigger a much larger chain reaction. Now add one more layer to this: timing. The timing of this escalation is not random. It comes at a moment when global attention is divided, when multiple regions are already dealing with crises, and when political leadership in many countries is under pressure. And that matters, because timing affects response. It affects decision-making. It affects how quickly and how effectively the international community can react. And in moments like this, delays or missteps can have serious consequences. So when you put all of this together, energy markets, alliances, deterrence, timing, you start to see the full picture. This is not just another conflict. This is a convergence point, a moment where multiple pressures, tensions, and interests collide at the same time. And that is why it matters. That is why the world is watching. And that is why the next moves on both sides are going to be absolutely critical. Because from this point forward, every decision carries weight. Every action sends a signal, and every signal has consequences. So now the question becomes, what exactly is the strategy behind all of this? What are these moves really trying to achieve? Because when you look closely, this is not just escalation. This is a power play. Because nothing you are seeing right now is random. Nothing about this escalation is accidental. This is calculated. This is deliberate. And above all, this is strategic. Let me explain what this means. When Israel makes a move like this, breaking a ceasefire, launching targeted operations, and doing so with speed and precision, it is not just reacting. It is sending a message, a very clear message. And that message is about deterrence, but not in the traditional sense. This is about restoring deterrence. Think about that for a second. Because in recent months there has been a growing perception, right or wrong, that the balance of power in the region has been shifting. That Iran, through its network of influence and regional positioning, has been gradually expanding its reach. And from a strategic standpoint, that creates pressure. Pressure to act, pressure to demonstrate capability, pressure to show that red lines still exist, and that crossing them will have consequences. So when Israel moves like this, it is not just targeting locations, it is targeting perception. It is trying to reshape how its adversaries and its allies view its willingness to act. Because in geopolitics, perception is power. If your adversary believes you will hesitate, they push further. If they believe you will act decisively, they think twice. And right now, Israel appears to be signaling one thing very clearly: there will be no hesitation. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Because Iran's response tells a strategy of its own. A very different, but equally calculated strategy. Iran did not respond slowly. It did not limit its reaction. Instead, it chose scale, speed, coordination. Why? Because Iran is also sending a message that says, escalation will not go unanswered, a message that says, we are prepared, a message that says, if you raise the stakes, we can match and potentially exceed that escalation. Let that sink in. Because what you are witnessing here is not just conflict, it is signaling, strategic signaling. Each side is communicating not just through words, but through actions, through targets, through timing, through intensity. And this kind of signaling has a very specific purpose. It is designed to shape the next move, to influence decisions before they are even made. But here's the part nobody is talking about. Both strategies, Israel's and Iran's, carry risk, serious risk. Because when you try to restore deterrence by escalating, you are walking a very fine line, a line between control and loss of control. Because escalation can achieve two things. It can force the other side to step back, or it can push them to step forward even more aggressively. And right now, it is not entirely clear which path this situation is heading down. Think about that. Both sides believe they are acting strategically. Both sides believe they are sending the right message. But what if those messages are being interpreted differently on the other side? What if what is meant as deterrence is seen as provocation? What if what is meant as strength is seen as a challenge? That is how conflicts escalate, not just through action, but through perception, misinterpretation, miscalculation. And once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to stop. Now add another layer to this strategy, domestic pressure. Because leaders are not operating in a vacuum. They are responding to internal dynamics, public opinion, political expectations, security concerns. And in moments like this, showing strength is not just a strategic choice. It is often a political necessity. Think about that. Backing down can be seen as weakness. Escalating can be seen as leadership. And that dynamic can push decisions in a direction that might not otherwise be taken. So when you look at this situation through that lens, you start to see something deeper. This is not just about external strategy. This is also about internal pressure, internal narratives, internal expectations. And when those internal and external pressures align, escalation becomes more likely, not less. But here's where things get even more complicated. Because strategy does not exist in isolation. It interacts. Israel's strategy affects Iran's decisions. Iran's response affects Israel's next move. And around them, other actors are watching, calculating, preparing. Which means this is not a static situation. This is a dynamic system. Every move changes the equation. Every response shifts the balance. And that is why predicting what happens next becomes so difficult. Because you are not just dealing with one strategy. You are dealing with multiple strategies, all interacting at the same time. And that is where the danger lies. Because when multiple strategies collide, the outcome is not always controlled. Sometimes, it is chaotic. So now we come to the next critical piece of this unfolding story, the fallout. How are leaders reacting? What are markets doing? What are experts saying behind the scenes? And it starts almost immediately. Within hours of this escalation, reactions begin pouring in from across the world. Governments issue statements, some call for restraint, others express concern. A few, more quietly, signal support for one side or the other. But here is where things get serious. The tone of these reactions matters just as much as the content. Because in moments like this, language is strategy. When a country says, "We urge de-escalation," what they are really saying is, "This is dangerous and it needs to stop." But when another country says, "We support our allies' right to defend itself," that is a signal too. A signal of alignment, a signal of positioning. And when you start to see those signals forming on both sides, you begin to understand that this is not just a regional issue anymore. This is becoming a global alignment moment. Think about that for a second. Lines, subtle at first, begin to form. And once those lines harden, stepping back becomes much harder. Now shift your attention to the markets. Because while political leaders are speaking, financial systems are reacting. Oil prices begin to move. Investors start reassessing risk. Safe haven assets, things like gold, begin to attract attention. Why? Because uncertainty is rising, and markets hate uncertainty. Let that sink in. The moment instability appears in a region as critical as the Middle East, the global economy starts adjusting in real time. Shipping routes are reevaluated, insurance costs for cargo increase, airspace risks are reconsidered. All of these factors feed into a larger economic picture that can affect countries thousands of miles away from the actual conflict zone. And this is where the ripple effect becomes very real, because it is not just governments reacting, it is businesses, it is investors, it is everyday people who may not even realize yet that something happening far away could soon impact their daily lives. But here is the part nobody is talking about. Behind the public statements, behind the headlines, there is another layer of reaction happening quietly. Intelligence agencies are working around the clock. Military commands are reassessing readiness levels. Diplomatic channels, some public, many private, are being activated at an intense pace. Think about that. Phone calls between world leaders, emergency meetings behind closed doors, back-channel communications aimed at preventing this situation from spiraling further. Because even as escalation is happening on the surface, there are efforts, urgent, high-stakes efforts, to contain it. But the question is, will they work? Because containment depends on timing, it depends on trust, and right now, both of those are in short supply. Now let's talk about public reaction, because in today's world, information spreads instantly. Images, videos, reports, accurate or not, move across social media at incredible speed, and that shapes perception. It shapes opinion. It can even shape policy, because leaders are not immune to public pressure. And when narratives begin to form, when people start choosing sides, expressing outrage, demanding action, that adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Think about what that means. This is no longer just a government-to-government issue. This is a global conversation, a global reaction. And sometimes that reaction can push events in unexpected directions. Now add expert analysis into the mix. Military analysts, geopolitical strategists, economists, they are all weighing in. And while their perspectives differ, one theme is becoming increasingly clear. This situation is unstable, highly unstable, because the speed of escalation combined with the scale of response creates a very narrow window for de-escalation. And if that window closes, the consequences could be significant. But here is where the story takes another turn. Not all reactions are visible immediately. Some take time, some build quietly, and those are often the most important. Because while the world is focused on the immediate fallout, longer-term shifts may already be in motion. Strategic repositioning, alliance recalibration, policy changes that do not happen overnight, but once they begin, they can reshape the entire landscape. Let that sink in. What we are seeing right now is just the first wave of fallout, the visible wave. But beneath it, deeper changes may already be underway, changes that will define not just the next few days, but the next few months, even years. And that brings us to the bigger picture, because to truly understand where this is heading, you have to zoom out. You have to look beyond the immediate reactions and see how this fits into the larger geopolitical puzzle. Because if you only focus on the immediate escalation, the strikes, the retaliation, the statements, you miss what this really is. This is not just a conflict. This is part of a much larger geopolitical shift that has been unfolding for years. And this moment, this is one piece of that puzzle. Let me explain. The global order is changing, slowly but unmistakably. Power is no longer concentrated the way it once was. Influence is being challenged. Alliances are being tested. And regions like the Middle East are becoming central arenas where these shifts play out. Think about that. This region has always been strategically important, but now its importance is amplified by the broader competition between global powers. Energy routes, military positioning, political influence, all of it intersects here. And when a conflict like this reignites, it doesn't just affect the countries directly involved, it becomes part of a larger contest, a contest over who shapes the future. Now here is where things get even more interesting. Over the past decade, we have seen a gradual transformation in how conflicts are fought. They are no longer just direct conventional wars. They are layered, complex, involving cyber operations, proxy networks, economic pressure, information campaigns. And what you are seeing between Israel and Iran fits into that pattern, because this is not just about direct confrontation, it is about influence across multiple fronts. It is about shaping the environment in which future decisions will be made. Let that sink in. Every strike, every response, every statement, these are not isolated actions.